Welcome everybody to the session on autonomous vehicles and advanced vehicle safety. My name's Paul Bowes. I'm going to be the moderator for this session. Just a few housekeeping items to begin with. There is simultaneous interpretation available for the session. If you look at the bottom of the screen on the far right, you should see what looks like a little planet or sphere. If you click on that, you can pick the language which you want to hear the presentation in. Please ignore the feed loop language selection at the top of the screen in feed loop. If you have any questions for the presenters, at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box. Please put them in the Q&A box and we will try to deal with questions for each speaker at the end if there's sufficient time. So in order to give them as much time as possible, we'll get started. First, we have Dominic Charlebois, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems in Winter Conditions. Dominic. I think you're on mute, Dominic.
There you go. Hi, Paul. Thanks. Do you see the presentation?
Yes. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Oh, sorry. Too much. Hi, my name is Dominic. I work at Transport Canada in the Innovation Center. I am a research officer over there, and I'm here to cool off the crowd here because I'm going to show you some videos about winter and what we learn about testing advanced technologies in winter. So any of you have driven in cold weather condition when ice is stuck on your windshield, when your windshield wiper can't do the job, when the visibility was so bad that you couldn't see the car in front of you, or because it blended with the snowbank, the road conditions require all your attention. Well, sensors might have the same challenge as human while operating in adverse weather. Welcome to Driving in Canada. So we're going to try to explore here what we did and what was the problem. So I'll drive you through the short presentation here. So the problem here is that we want to develop test methodologies for testing ADAS features on our test track, and also to assess the performance level outside standard ideal condition. So we went out there and we winterized our equipment because it's designed to work in summertime, and we used the same vehicle during the summer and the winter to have a good baseline because we're very familiar with how summer testing goes. So what did we use? Two very important key elements. My son would be very proud with a big fan of Frozen. So we use ice and snow, and we dressed up the dummies with winter attire that is found in big box store. So we were able to design some relevant scenarios that are repeatable out of all the testing we did. And we learned also that not all systems or not all vehicles are born equal, or they perform differently. So as you can see on the right-hand side, we have two pictures of the same street thanks to a Google map. One is in the winter, one is in the summer. So about 3 months of the year on average, Canadian cities are experiencing that type of phenomenon. Therefore, we want to see what degradation associated with ADAS performance we can see under those conditions. And we focus just on detection capability, which means that, as you can see on the picture here, the snow on the road would affect the traction, but we didn't look into that. We just focused on, can the car see? So we went out there and we modified our equipment. So as you at the top picture is one of our piece of equipment. So we put a heat mat on it because there's electronics in there and brushes to clear the belt that's pulling the dummy, as you'll see in the video. So just adapting some of the equipment to be able to use it in the winter. And we use a snow cannon as well to apply a uniform layer of snow on the vehicles for repetitivity of our testing. And we put winter tires on all our vehicles. Through the methodology, we cleared the pathway leading to the impact point with the vehicle to reduce impact because materials become more brittle when under cold weather, and as well we didn't want to reapply snow all the time, and to keep a white background to see if that makes a difference in terms of contrast. We modified the appearance of the dummies as you'll see in the pictures, with jackets, umbrellas, toques, and we covered the vehicle targets with snow. And cover the vehicles with ice as well over the sensors to see if that makes a difference in the detection capability. And just to give you an idea, we had 5 vehicles for detecting other vehicles, target vehicles, and 4 vehicles for vulnerable road users, which was an adult and a child. So what's the testing all about? Well, as you in the middle here, the scenario is designed is from the European regulation. So you approach at a constant speed at 20, 42, and 60 kilometers per hour towards a stopped vehicle. And and then we capture the response of the test vehicle through the type of warning that they're doing. So I'll give you I hope you can see on the screen. So we're driving down the path here, and the modification we made to the procedures that we swerved at the last minute because we didn't want to impact the stop target. We captured just the forward collision warning, because the forward collision warning is a precursor of the automatic emergency braking. So we wanted to just evaluate that. So I'm showing you this test matrix here, and you have 3 vehicle targets over there, the speeds 20, 42, and 60, and we had 5 vehicles. I'm going to bring your attention to the fact that we put ice on a car and snow on a car to block the front sensors. So just looking at these results in red, 3 out of 5 vehicles did not generate a forward collision warning when it was covered with ice. And out of the 3 vehicles, only one displayed a message about, hey, buddy, the system is offline. So we had a message saying that there was an obstruction and the systems was not working. The other 2 did not do that. The 2 vehicles were like, one vehicle, sorry, the number 1 vehicle here was not affected by it. And the last vehicle here on the matrix was slightly delayed. And by slightly delayed is like 0.3 seconds. That doesn't sound large, but at 60 kilometers per hour, that's 5 meters. So that could make a difference potentially in like avoiding an impact with a parked car. So the next scenario that we looked at, we're approaching. It gives you an idea of the test, but like the target here is covered with snow. It would simulate you're driving on the road and you have like, like people are not cleaning their car or the snow accumulation on the back. So looking at this, it was compared to dry and snow, and dry is there's no snow on it, and snow, well, we applied it with the snow cannon. 4 vehicles did not detect the first target, which is a European target that we have, and the last target on the screen, which is a 3D target that is globally being used right now. And then in yellow, the signal was delayed through under those scenarios, and some of them were improved. So you're going to tell me, well, I saw green and yellow on the same box. Well, the box is referencing the 3 speeds, and each test was repeated 5 times. So it just shows to highlight the variability in response of the systems. Another very interesting scenario here is we're driving down the street. And this is based on Euro NCAP test procedure. And then we have a dummy being pulled perpendicularly towards it. And the silhouette here, this is why we dressed the dummy with a jacket, hat, backpack, umbrella, is to change the silhouette. Here is my colleague, Shavang, who generously posed here with an umbrella and carrying a bag. So we're just driving at a constant speed. And then the dummy is going to be on the passenger side and is going to come across, as you could see. And the test is conclusive here. Shavang is safe, so nobody was harmed in this video, but it just generated into creating a more complex scenario for some vehicles, and I'll show you that about now. So we had 4 vehicles with speed performance between 20 and 50, and the difference between the other tests is that the speed range here is based on the performance of the vehicle. From the left to the right, and the clothing, this is the Transport Canada 2021 winter selection. So on the left-hand side is the standard dummy, and as you move towards the right, we increase we put a jacket, a hat, a backpack, and an umbrella. So I'd like to just bring your attention to one vehicle that was challenged in all winter condition. It didn't react to the dummy, like it hit the dummy at every time. And we had 2 vehicles that were challenged by the umbrella and the bag. And that means that we usually in the procedure, we bring the speed down by 5 kilometers per hour and repeat the test. And then it was able to detect and avoid a collision. So it was challenged by that. The other last scenario I'd like to touch base on is the child scenario. So the car is driving again 20 to 30 kilometers per hour, and that's based on the performance of the vehicle to avoid a collision. And then the child is coming up in front. And just a note, this is my son coming back from school last winter, and he was carrying his backpack. So that doesn't really look like a child. So we try to take that into consideration to designing this test. So we're driving down, we kept the white background in the back, and it's obstructed by two vehicles. And the child comes out right at the last minute for a middle point impact with the vehicle. So for that test matrix, we had 4 vehicles, speed range from 20 to 30, and all the different condition. Again, this is the child winter collection. So up to the backpack and the hat at the end. So one vehicle was challenged with, it didn't respond to any of those scenarios, and we weren't able to do it in the summer, lack of time. Hopefully we can do that this year. 2 vehicles had a more frequent impact with the dummy when we added the backpack, and 2 vehicles were not really affected by the fact it was white in the background or adding the extra clothing until, as you can see, adding the backpack for one of them. So what's the take-home message? Well, safety is a priority for Transport Canada. So even though, I took the picture of the silhouette of my son, I mean, there are dummies, no dummies were armed in the making of these videos. And when we try to cover the vehicle with ice and snow, it's inconsistent in its application. It's hard to use the winter snow cannon. It depends on humidity, ambient temperature. So we need to refine a bit of our procedure to have a consistent surface for testing. And the camera, well, the windshield is really hot, so it's very hard to capture ice. So we'll need to work on an artificial device if we want to try to block the camera sensor on vehicles. Which target to use? You saw we use like 3 targets. So therefore we would go with the last one that looks like a 3D car, because it proved to be as easy as the others to use, but also it's becoming more and more adopted through international testing procedure. And adult, pedestrian, and child, well, we're going to go ahead and explore other test specimen, increase our sample size for testing with vehicles with those hard condition, with an umbrella or with the kid with a backpack. It seemed to have made a difference, but our sample size of vehicles was kind of small. So a special thanks to CARS for this opportunity to share testing and research activities. That's much appreciated. And I'd like to highlight the dedicated team that made this research possible. Annie and Guillaume at PMG Technology, and all the technicians that usually don't do winter testing, and they went out there even if it was cold and did a good job. So and Shivang and Benoit at Transport Canada as well for their enormous contribution to this research paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. There's a few minutes for questions. If you want to type any questions into the Q&A box at the bottom. I will take this opportunity to start with a question. Clearly, there was different performances in different vehicles. We know that for other systems, there are NCAP systems that allow people to know how they're rated. Would you do the same here? I mean, I understand this is regulatory testing, but that could be very important information. For example, someone in the questions asked which vehicle B was. So there's going to be a lot of interest in knowing which ones. If I'm in Florida, I don't really care that the snow didn't work. We're not in Florida. So if the system works better or doesn't work better, I'd like to know that before I buy it.
I totally agree, Paul. I mean, it is interesting, and you're right. We do not have an NCAP program in Canada. I think this information, if we can do more vehicles, then you could disseminate this information to the public. Right now, we went out there trying to figure out what's the best way, or what kind of tools would we need if you want to do winter testing. This is why we took like the three target that we had in our inventory and tried to compare them to each other, not just on the performance level, control, but like how complicated is it? Like if we hit it, will it break? I mean, they're very expensive piece of equipment. So we were trying to figure out like what's the best method and what's the most repetitive method. Because if you want to compare apples to apples and compare every vehicle to each vehicle, we need to have a robust method, or else it's not going to be fair for comparative measures for the consumer or the general public.
Two quick questions to finish off. First of all, will Transport Canada test the ability to avoid animal impacts?
That's a very interesting question. We've been looking at it for quite a while, and up to last year, there was just one vehicle that would detect animals. But we are getting animal targets for next year, and hopefully we can look at what's being done in Europe with animal impacts, because they've been a bit more proactive about it. So hopefully we can include that into our testing matrix.
So final question, how far away do you think standards are in terms of some of these systems?
Standards. Well, there are methodologies out there, and hopefully policy and regulatory folks can inspire themselves with the success of each one of them and their strength to make them to select the best appropriate ones for Canada, or develop one on our own. But I think this winter component here, or more challenging component, really highlights that most of the vehicle we tested in the summertime did extremely well. It's just if you change some parameters, it's much more challenging. So my regulatory friends won't like a more complex test. So we'll see.
Thank you, Dominic.
You're welcome.
Next, we have Heather Walker, who's going to talk about improving the public's perception of autonomous vehicles by communicating the consistency of autonomous vehicle algorithms. Heather?
All right. We're all good. We can see everything. Perfect. All right. So my name's Heather. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Guelph. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the work that myself and my colleagues managed to do over the last year or so. So kind of the general premise behind the study is related to the fact that autonomous vehicles are projected to be safer than human drivers at some point. And in fact, initial pilot research from different various sources has indicated that AVs are involved in nearly half the number of collisions per million miles driven than human drivers. And so essentially they are expected to reduce roadway collisions by up to 90% once they become widespread on roads, eventually when that happens. However, despite already being shown to be safer, currently people still don't really trust autonomous vehicles and generally seem to be, if not against their presence on roads, just kind of generally averse and wary to their presence on roads. And this obviously became even more true following those two incidents those fatal incidents that involved the Tesla and Uber self-driving vehicles. And the general feeling presently among the public is that autonomous vehicles would have to be nearly 5 times safe as human drivers in order to be considered equally as acceptable. However, people's aversions to AVs didn't really start once they saw these incidents happening and saw them being reported in the media. So what other reasons might there have been for people's kind of initial dislike of autonomous vehicles? And there are kind of a number of underlying reasons that could be contributing to this aversion. So one might be a dislike of computer algorithms in general. So people tend to not like computers making decisions, particular moral-based decisions, and instead prefer that it's humans that are making the decisions, even when humans make many more errors than computer algorithms and make more mistakes and perform more poorly. Your average person also doesn't really understand how computer algorithms work. And oftentimes when we don't like things and we don't understand them, that leads us to find them perhaps unpredictable and therefore untrustworthy. And relating more specifically to AVs themselves, it's also possible that some of the aversion comes from the potential loss of agency that people would experience or drivers would experience over situations and outcomes. particularly since it's still not kind of set in, just hasn't been really discussed whether the safety of the driver would still be prioritized over the safety of a number of different other individuals that are involved in a particular situation. And it was essentially these kind of issues that brought us to our overarching research question, whether, I guess, highlighting the consistency or explicitly comparing the consistency of AVs and human behaviors, particularly the predictability of computer programming against the kind of inherently unpredictable nature of human behavior, and whether making those comparisons or making those details explicit would be able to reduce or temper some of the AV aversion. And so to begin addressing that question, we ran a number of studies where we used essentially moral dilemmas to assess people's perceptions of both AVs and human drivers when they are forced to make a moral decision in a driving scenario. And so in this baseline scenario, so the details of which were common across the 3 studies that I'll be reporting today, essentially, a vehicle was driving down a road or down a hill when its brakes failed, and this vehicle could either be piloted by a human or piloted autonomously. And if nothing was done, the vehicle would continue straight and hit and kill 5 pedestrians in a crosswalk. Alternatively, the vehicle could be turned and it could hit a parked car in order to come to a stop, but in doing so would kill a stranger getting out of that parked car. And so essentially in each study, participants received some variation of the scenario and then afterwards judged the pilot on a number of different dimensions. And so these included the kind of inherent goodness or badness of the action, as well as the morality of it, which we then later combined into an aggregate called moral perception, as well as other metrics like predictability, perceived harm and blame, the acceptability of the action. And then in study 3, we also added a metric of trustworthiness. And so having said that, in study 1, we first wanted to look at whether explaining AV skills and their predictability would have any impact on AV aversion. So in addition to that base scenario that I just described, participants would be randomly assigned to either an explanation or a no explanation condition. So in the no explanation condition, apart from the basic details of the scenario, they received no other information about the pilot. Whereas in the explanation condition, depending on whether it was a human or a AV pilot in that particular scenario, they would either receive an explanation detailing the consistency and skills of an autonomous vehicle and its algorithms, or they could receive an explanation detailing the inconsistency and changeability of human behavior. And essentially what we expected to see was that although there might still be some bias against autonomous vehicles and that they would be judged more negatively compared to the human drivers, we also expected that explaining essentially the AV superior capabilities along with their predictability would reduce the magnitude of AV aversion essentially. And so in terms of just kind of the overall main effects, we didn't indeed see that evidence of persistent AV aversion. So people did still prefer the actions of a human pilot. Unsurprisingly as well, people preferred the action that resulted in fewer deaths as compared to the action that resulted in 5. And then in terms of the explanation manipulation, what we saw is that overall people preferred scenarios where an explanation on the skills of the pilot was provided in addition to the main details, in contrast to when no explanation was given. And this was further highlighted in the interactions we found in study 1. So in particular, it seemed as though explaining the actions of AVs and their skills did seem to have a boost on their perceived predictability to the point that they were actually judged as significantly more predictable than human drivers, whose ratings did not really change that much, regardless of the explanation that was given for their behavior. And then kind of following from that, providing an explanation also improved judgments of blames for AV, so it actually reduced the amount of blameworthiness to the point that they were actually much more on par with judgments of blame for human drivers. And then in addition to just those main comparisons, we also ran correlations between our different metrics of judgment. And here we find that perceived predictability was positively correlated with moral perception and acceptability, and to a lesser extent, negatively correlated with harm and blame. And essentially just the kind of overall nature of these relationships, the direction, are consistent with the idea that making AVs seem more predictable and perhaps intelligible would be associated with improvements on other metrics of judgment as well. So given that the actions of the 2 pilots in study 1 resulted in negative outcomes, in study 2, then what we wanted to assess was people's judgments when the pilots' actions and decisions could also result in a more favorable outcome. So here, in addition to the explanation versus no explanation manipulation, what we did was we added a third possible action outcome, one where the pilot's maneuvering, quick maneuvering resulted in the vehicle hitting a stone fountain instead and resulting in no deaths. And again, so although we expected to see typical bias against AVs, we did, in addition to the effects of the explanation, also predict that that positive outcome would reduce the severity of AV aversion as well. So indeed, in terms of main effects, what we saw was mostly similar to what we found from study 1. There was still evidence of AV aversion, and people still preferred getting an explanation for the pilot's actions as opposed to not. And then even in terms of action here, the results are, somewhat unsurprising. People did prefer the action that resulted in no deaths, followed then by actions resulting in 1, and then their least preferred was the action resulting in 5 deaths. And also mirroring study 1, we again saw that interaction for predictability, where explaining AV's actions boosted their predictability to the point that they were significantly more predictable than human drivers. But the most interesting results for study 2 came from some of the three-way interactions that we observed for ratings of moral perception and overall acceptability. So there were kind of 2 different things related to that positive action. So the first was that we saw that AVs completing a positive action were actually judged much more similarly to the human pilot also making that same action. So essentially the overall average distance between the 2 points was quite a bit smaller, or was smaller than the difference between the 2 pilots when they engaged in a negative action. Additionally, we also saw that AVs making a positive action were judged more positively than the human pilot making a negative action, which is obviously interesting because, as I kind of alluded to in the introduction, some past research has indicated that people prefer the actions of humans no matter how poorly they perform. So it was interesting to see that here, as the result of our manipulations, we were boosting the perceptions of AVs, if not to the top, at least above humans in some context. And again, the nature of the correlations that we ran were, although slightly weaker, still in the same direction as those that we found in study 1. And then finally in study 3, we looked at a slightly different form of unpredictability, specifically whether a change in vehicular control immediately prior to that action being taken would have any impact on judgments of AVs and human drivers. And so specifically here, either the pilot could remain in control throughout the entire scenario, so basically mirroring that the base scenario, or control could switch between the 2 pilots. So could either have the AV mode taking over from the human, or the human could take back manual control of the autonomous vehicle. And then an action would be taken by that new pilot. And then after receiving that scenario, participants would then rate the pilot that ultimately made the decision on a number of those different dimensions. And here we expected that the change in control would be particularly detrimental to judgments of AVs, just because an AV taking control from a human kind of reduces their agency and control over the situation. And so in study 3, again, the main effects of pilot and action mirrored those from study 1 and 2. People generally preferred the actions overall of humans and preferred the action of only killing 1. And then in terms of that takeover manipulation, we actually found a main effect of takeover such that any change in control seemed to be judged more negatively overall than when the same pilot was in control the whole time. And in particular, this effect seemed to be driven more actually by the pattern of judgments for the human driver rather than for the AV, which was actually counter to what we had predicted. This was especially true for ratings of acceptability, where the human driver taking control back from the AV was deemed as less acceptable than if they were in control the entire time. In contrast, whether the AV took over or not had much less impact on their judgments. And finally, looking at correlations, the relationship between predictability and those other variables, including that newly added metric of trustworthiness, mirror those that we found in study 1 and 2, indicating that increased predictability is associated with improved judgments in other areas as well. And so in summary, basically what we found was that despite being rated more predictable in some cases, we still did see some evidence of that bias against autonomous vehicles, which just shows how persistent that bias still is. However, on a more positive note, explaining their skills and their consistency did seem to reduce some of that aversion, resulting in AVs being judged more comparably to human drivers. AV aversion was also reduced for positive actions, so both compared to humans also making positive actions and in comparison to humans that made decisions resulting in negative outcomes. And finally, we found that people in general were averse to takeover actions of any kind, and it was rather than AVs being judged more harshly, it was actually humans that were judged more harshly for taking control and then subsequently making a decision. And so kind of our interpretation of these results is that perhaps any intervention that or messaging that highlights the skills and predictability of AVs, as well as their potential for positive action, may in the future have some potential to improve public perception of autonomous vehicles, and at least in that way reduce perhaps some of the barriers to their eventual mass adoption. So I'd just like to acknowledge all of the people that were actually involved in this project, as well as the funding body. And then, I guess if we have any time for questions.
Great, thank you. We do have time for questions. So if anybody has questions for Heather, type them in the Q&A and we can ask them. Well, I can start off. Is it possible that people are just more forgiving of other human beings because human beings are fallible and there's an expectation a computer is perfect, and so it must have really screwed up if it didn't?
Yeah, I think some of that is related to that, and also I think people, because we know how ourselves think, and we assume that most other people think the same way and can behave the same way and have the same capabilities. I think in that way we are also just have lower expectations perhaps for human drivers. So yeah, it's true that perhaps our standards are higher for autonomous vehicles, just because we've been told that they are supposed to be perfect. So yeah.
Clearly not from people who use Windows. Do you have some sense of explanation on why a human taking over from a computer was rated less favorable if they don't trust the computer?
One of our kind of first thoughts, because that was the most recent study, so we haven't had a lot of time to think about it, but we perhaps think that it may be due to the fact that in some ways perhaps people would rather let the autonomous vehicle take the blame for what is occurring, because it's impersonal and it's easier to blame than a human making an action. It's also, we didn't provide, for at least for the study, we didn't provide details on what would have occurred had the takeover not happened. So it's also possible that people are unsure perhaps if the autonomous vehicle would have performed better or worse or the same, especially if people perceive that they are supposed to be able to perform better. So that's kind of our initial thoughts, is that it might be that it's either uncertainty or it's people don't want humans to take the blame for their errors if an AV could.
Okay, we have another question. How did your research define AVs? Did you use the SAE levels or a different definition?
No, we didn't. It was fairly simple. It was just it was just a self-driving vehicle. We didn't discuss or provide participants with details on like the extent to which it was. But I believe in even though we didn't explicitly state it, the underlying kind of sense that we gave to participants was that it was pretty much a fully autonomous vehicle and not something that had autonomous features, but was not fully autonomous because we did call it a self-driving car. So.
One last question. If I'm a manufacturer and I want to sell a vehicle with an ADAS or some sort of autonomy, what do I have to do to get people to trust me?
I think what we learned from this study is perhaps we just need to share more publicly just, what AVs are capable of, perhaps the actual rates of their successes, because obviously people take, it's kind of like with plane crashes. People remember the one plane crash or the two plane crashes, but they don't remember like the thousands upon thousands a day that get somewhere. So I think perhaps providing the public, because I know like obviously as researchers, we are more intimately familiar with a lot of those statistics and the things like that. But as kind of a general consumer, I would say that there's not a lot of information besides like, oh, AVs are supposed to be better. And so one of the things that we also want to do, one of the next studies we want to look into is providing like within these little moral dilemmas, the actual rates that, say like if a AV is in control, there's only like a 5% chance that they're going to hit those 5 people versus if there's a human, say that there's a much larger chance, just due to natural human inattention and things like that. So I think sharing more of that with the general public, obviously in a easy to understand way, but I think some of that information needs to be passed beyond just kind of the research and the manufacturer circles.
Just quickly, one last question. Somebody asked if, given that morality can be subjective, could the AV be programmed to reflect one's own moral objectives?
That's definitely, I think realistically it could. I know I've read some studies where they compared whether like it's not our studies, but it was another study where the AV's actions were either programmed by the manufacturer, chosen by the driver. And I think obviously that could be manipulated. Whether that is something that is ever left up to the consumer, I think is probably much less likely. I think probably there would have to be a large body of people that eventually decide what the most moral, like the general consensus of the public is and whatever the percentage is for those decisions. But I don't think it'll ever probably be left up to individual consumers themselves to be like, oh, I always want myself, or like it's okay if the vehicle injures up to like X number of people, because that's what I'm okay with. I don't think that would necessarily be something that ever happens.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Very interesting. Next, we have Carol Lau, who's going to talk about low-speed automated shuttles, passenger experience in different traffic environments. Carol?
Okay, thanks, Paul, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Carol Lau. I'm a human factors specialist at Transport Canada, presenting today on behalf of the team. So low-speed automated shuttles have the potential to be a new mode of transportation. They're designed to operate at limited speeds and are considered to be an SAE Level 4 automated driving system, meaning that it has the capability to perform the entire dynamic task by itself on predefined routes. There are a lot of ongoing automated shuttle trials in the past few years, and particularly in the United States, Europe, Japan, as well as Canada. And today I'll be talking about the Canadian trials. So there were 2 Canadian trials of automated shuttles operating in 2 different environments. The first was held in August of 2019, where the automated shuttle operated on a segregated path with no traffic. And the second occurred the following year on public urban roads with mixed traffic. Both vehicles were electric and had ADS capability of SAE Level 4. Prior to each trial, both shuttles had extensive crash avoidance testing to verify its safety prior to public use. For the segregated path trial, it was a 3-day private demonstration held on a predefined trail. The vehicle was equipped with lap belts and accessibility ramps. And for safety reasons, the shuttle operated on an average speed of 12 kilometers an hour with only 2 passengers plus an operator on board. Typically, it could seat up to 4 passengers plus the operator. The shuttle drove along a predefined circuit with pickup and drop-off locations at both ends, and the paved route contained straight segments, different hill grades, bridges, and potholes. The following year, in November 2020, a 10-day public trial was held on urban roads with mixed traffic. This vehicle was equipped with seatbelts, accessibility ramps, as well as audio and visual cues for announcements. During the trial, the shuttle operated at a maximum speed of 15 kilometers an hour with only 4 passengers and an operator on board. Typically, it could seat 12 passengers, 6 sitting and 6 standing, plus the operator on board. Because this trial was held in the middle of a pandemic, COVID-19 health and safety protocols were implemented. The predefined route was approximately 1,500 meters with 4 planned stops along the way, and the route was shared with other road users such as pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers. Now, although these low-speed automated shuttles can offer a new means of transportation, the success in the use of them ultimately depends on the passenger's experience and acceptance. So it's very important to understand their experience interacting with these automated shuttles. So for our research objectives, we were interested in knowing what were the passengers' initial impressions of automated shuttles, what are their perceptions of safety and the potential applications to use them. And do note that our primary focus of this research was on passenger experience and safety and not on the vehicle performance itself. For recruitment, in order to ride on the automated shuttle, for the segregated path trial, passengers had to pre-register through a private email invitation. Following their ride, trained Transport Canada employees approached them to complete a semi-structured interview that contained both open-ended and rating scale types of questions. Over the course of 3 days, we managed to interview 76 passengers. For the urban road trial, passengers were able to register online via a private invitation or using an online booking system that was open to the public. Following their ride, they were asked to fill out a self-report online questionnaire that was administered using QR codes and a follow-up email linking to the online survey. A total of 182 responses were used for data analysis. The types of data that we collected included shuttle interest, why were they interested in riding the shuttle in the first place, their overall ride quality and comfort, its characteristics, for example, how is the speed of the shuttle, their safety perceptions and measures, as well as future places and reasons to use automated shuttles. For the results, I'll be reporting on summary statistics. Because the wording and the scaling items were different for the trials, we binned the data into smaller groups to allow for comparisons. Percent total of responses are reported where appropriate, and common themes were identified using a thematic analysis for open-ended questions. For familiarity with automated vehicles and automated shuttles in general, individuals from the segregated path were more familiar or very familiar with automated vehicles. This is possibly due to the fact that these passengers were somehow involved with the project or were friends and relatives of those that were involved. Riders from the urban road trial were more divided in familiarity, and this sample group is more representative of the general public. As for interest for riding the automated shuttle, the majority of the participants from both trials were interested due to personal and technology interests. For the shuttle's ride quality, the majority of the passengers from both trials felt that the ride was smooth. Individuals from the segregated path felt that the speed of the shuttle would be more useful in a closed area environment rather than a public road. And the majority of the passengers from the public urban road trial felt that the speed was too slow or appropriate for its application. For accessibility, all passengers from the segregated path reported that the shuttle was easy to board. However, there were some concerns from the urban road trial. For example, the lack of audio announcements for the visual impaired, narrow seats, the lack of space for wheelchairs, as well as the high step when boarding and exiting. For safety equipment, passengers from both trials noted the seatbelts in the gigantic emergency stop button in the shuttles. This may be due to the safety debriefing that they received prior to riding the shuttle and the necessity to use the seatbelts while on board. In addition to those two things, the urban road passengers noted the onboard human assistant as a safety measure. When asked about additional safety equipment that they would want to see in the shuttle, many passengers from the segregated path would like to see airbags and roll cages, so crashworthiness and occupant protection equipment. In contrast, the majority of the urban road passengers didn't feel like the shuttle needed additional safety equipment. When passengers were asked about what kinds of information they would like the shuttle to communicate, for both trials, they wanted to know their current position on the route, what the next stop was, any status delays and/or incidents, as well as wanting to know how to reach an emergency contact when needed. Next, I'll talk about safety perception and trust. Individuals from the segregated path felt that it would be acceptable to share the same paths as an automated shuttle as a pedestrian. When they were asked if they would still feel safe riding a shuttle in a closed area with no traffic, the majority of the responses indicated yes for all three scenarios. So for example, having only passengers on board, having a remote assistant, so someone that's not physically in the shuttle but has control over the vehicle in a remote location, and or having an onboard assistant. However, when they were asked if they would feel safe riding a shuttle in public areas with other traffic, responses were more hesitant with having only passengers on board. Responses were mixed for having only a remote assistant. The most acceptable scenario for public areas would be to have an onboard assistant present. Moving on to the urban road trial, the majority of the respondents trusted the shuttle's ability to transport them safely, and they felt safe sharing roads with an automated shuttle as any type of road user, so as a pedestrian, a driver, or a cyclist. When they were asked if they will feel safe riding a shuttle in a closed area with no traffic, the majority of the responses indicated yes for all three scenarios. Similar results are seen for the public areas with other traffic, but with a little more hesitancy if only passengers were on board and if there were only an online remote assistant. And again, having an onboard assistant was perceived as the most safe and acceptable scenario. For future uses and applications, the top three places passengers would use a low-speed automated shuttle would be in closed campuses with no other traffic, for local travel within the city, or for their first and last segment of their trip. For example, from an airport moving to a parking lot. The top three reasons why passengers would use automated shuttles would be for its convenience. For example, if it's raining outside and they don't feel like walking, the shuttle being environmentally friendly, given that it's an electric vehicle, and for fun. So to summarize the results, overall, it was a positive feedback. Passengers felt excited to experience new technology. They felt that the ride quality was smooth and safe, and they liked that the shuttle can have a positive impact on the environment. The main criticism of the shuttle was its slow speed and that it can benefit from additional testing in different weather conditions. So for example, winter testing. Automated shuttles show promise as an alternative means of transportation. However, it could benefit from additional testing. And low-speed automated shuttles are purposely designed to be slow for safety reasons, but more research is required to find the ideal design that's both safe and practical. And in general, passengers felt safe while riding the shuttles. And as the awareness of this technology increases over time, people can become more accepting of automated vehicles. This was actually shown in one of our public opinion consumer awareness surveys conducted at Transport Canada. So to conclude, overall positive experiences with low-speed automated shuttles, although the speed was perceived as being impractical. Automated shuttles are still fairly new concepts and could benefit from additional road testing. And this research shows early insights into the research needs of automated shuttles, as well as the policy and standards requirements. So a special thanks to all those involved in either the segregated path trial or the public trial. And special thanks to you for tuning in. Any questions?
Thank you, Carol. I'd remind anybody who have any questions about Carol's presentation to type them in the Q&A. If I can start off with a question, you had people who were familiar with the shuttle,
Yeah.
different in the two ones, and people who are unfamiliar. Did you review the answers separately by those two groups to see if the people who are unfamiliar had different thoughts than people who were familiar at the beginning?
We did not do that analysis because we had so much data to work with. But I figured that those who are less familiar with automated vehicles in general would have more hesitancy being in an automated shuttle by themselves, and they would prefer to have like a supervisory figure on board with them.
When you asked them whether they thought the shuttle could operate on a pathway that also had pedestrians.
Yeah.
Did you ask them how they would feel if a shuttle were operating on a pathway where they were the pedestrian?
Yeah, the question was asking if they were the pedestrian sharing the same paths with an automated shuttle.
And how would they feel? Yeah, okay.
For both types of trials, they were comfortable sharing paths as a pedestrian with an automated shuttle. However, for the public trial, there were some individuals that weren't comfortable sharing a path with an automated shuttle as a driver, possibly because it's too slow, it gets in the way, and it could cause like traffic for being slow and unpredictable if it encounters a situation it's not programmed to handle.
Okay, thank you. There's no more questions, so why don't we move on? Thank you, Carol. And last but not least, we have Yasmin Haddad, who's going to talk about road safety and autonomous vehicles, a neo-institutional analysis. Yasmin, the screen is yours.
Ça va là, vous m'entendez? Allô?
Yeah, we don't have your slides.
On vous entend.
Oui,
One.
là c'est bon normalement. Là, vous les avez.
Oui, vous êtes prêts.
Super. Merci. Donc, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Yasmine Haddad, je suis doctorante à l'université Gustave Eiffel. Et ce que je vous présente aujourd'hui, c'est une analyse néo-institutionnelle pour essayer d'étudier l'évolution du mode de gouvernance de la police publique sécurité routière en France, compte tenu des changements initiés par la robomobilité. Donc, ça sera une présentation assez classique. On sait tous aujourd'hui que le véhicule autonome constitue une révolution technologique qui met en avant une mobilité plus sûre, plus propre et plus accessible. Elle constitue de ce fait un enjeu majeur pour la sécurité routière. Et en fait, quand on parle de véhicule autonome, on associe souvent la notion d'automatisation de la conduite et par conséquent la notion de délégation partielle ou totale de l'activité de conduite automobile à un système automatisé. En cela, le véhicule autonome est donc porteur de profonds changements pour notre système de transport, même aussi pour tout ce qui est système réglementaire et législatif. Dans le cadre de cette recherche, on essaie d'anticiper l'évolution probable du mode de gouvernance de la politique publique de sécurité routière en France, compte tenu des changements initiés par l'introduction des véhicules autonomes dans le système de transport. Pour mener à bien à cette recherche, nous nous sommes appuyés sur un cadrage théorique issu de l'approche institutionnelle de North et de la théorie des coûts de transaction de Coase et de Williamson. Ces deux ancrages théoriques vont nous permettre d'apporter un essai de définition du concept de gouvernance de la sécurité routière et enfin anticiper le mode de gouvernance choisi par les acteurs impliqués dans cette politique publique. Pour ce qui est des hypothèses de la théorie des coûts de transaction retenus dans le cadre de cette recherche, il se décline en deux groupes. Nous sommes au début face à des hypothèses en lien avec le comportement des contractants, donc à savoir la rationalité limitée, qui est, elle, liée directement à l'incertitude et à l'incapacité des acteurs à anticiper l'ensemble des actions futures. Et donc, à l'instant T, ils ne peuvent pas prendre des décisions, des décisions qui seront justes pour des événements qui ne peuvent pas anticiper. La deuxième hypothèse, c'est l'hypothèse d'opportunisme. Donc, on ne va pas se dire que l'ensemble ou toute personne qu'on a en face de nous est opportuniste, mais qu'il se pourrait que pour satisfaire une envie personnelle ou gagner quelque chose, ces acteurs-là vont avoir un comportement opportuniste en cachant la vérité, par exemple, ou autre. Le deuxième groupe d'hypothèses, c'est l'hypothèse liée à l'attribut de la transaction. Donc, on a trois attributs, à savoir la spécificité des actifs. Donc, la spécificité des actifs en fait, se définit par étant un investissement ou un actif ou investi dans le cadre de la transaction, mais qui sera difficilement redéployable dans le cadre d'une autre transaction. Donc, leur redéployabilité engendrera des coûts supplémentaires. La deuxième attribut, c'est l'incertitude. Donc, elle est liée très fortement à la rationalité limitée. Donc, en ayant dans l'incapacité d'anticiper l'ensemble des événements futurs, ceci augmentera l'incertitude et par conséquent conduira à une augmentation des coûts de transaction. Et enfin, la fréquence, qui est en fait le nombre de fois ou la fréquence selon laquelle la transaction va avoir lieu. Donc, dans le cas où on a des actifs très spécifiques et une forte fréquence, ceci engendrera donc des coûts supplémentaires. Donc, les caractéristiques des transactions vont directement déterminer les structures de gouvernance que choisiront les acteurs. Ils choisiront donc une structure de gouvernance ou un mode de coordination qui minimisera au maximum les coûts de transaction supportés dans le cadre de cette transaction. Pour ce qui est de la méthodologie, donc, on procède par recherche documentaire et une approche discursive. Donc, l'approche discursive à travers de l'observation participante et des entretiens semi-directifs. Pour ce qui est de l'observation participante, elle a débuté en juillet 2019 à travers des conférences, donc notre participation à des conférences, des journées d'études, de groupes de travail ou de réflexion. Pour ce qui est des entretiens semi-directifs, ils ont commencé donc en mars 2020 et ils se sont finis en mai 2021. En raison de la situation du Covid, etc., ça a un petit peu rendu difficile la collecte des données. On est à 42 entretiens, leur durée moyenne est de 1h30 et on a questionné ou enquêté sur l'ensemble des acteurs impliqués dans la politique publique sécurité routière en France, à savoir l'État et ses différentes institutions, les constructeurs automobiles et les équipementiers, les gestionnaires du trafic routier, les assurances, les usagers de la route et le milieu de la recherche. Il faudra noter que la recherche s'intéresse qu'au cas d'usage des véhicules individuels. Donc, on n'est pas sur les navettes autonomes, les robotaxis, etc. On est vraiment sur le véhicule individuel que vous, moi, allons demain utiliser. Donc, pour la recherche documentaire, on a procédé par mots-clés. On s'est intéressé à tout type de documents, rapports, thèses ou articles qu'on a retrouvés sur des catalogues de bibliothèques, sur des bases de données ou sur le web. On a utilisé 3 langues, donc français, anglais, un petit peu l'arabe, c'était en nombre très peu. Et enfin, donc, cette recherche documentaire a commencé depuis le début de la thèse et elle continue à travers une veille documentaire. Pour ce qui est des entretiens de semi-directif, donc nous avons établi, avant de commencer, donc nous avons rédigé un guide d'entretien. À titre d'exemple, on a fait un petit retour sur certains concepts clés, sur des questions de terminologie, de comment les acteurs ou les enquêtés envisageaient des véhicules dans 20 ans, dans 30 ans, et surtout le véhicule de niveau 5 totalement autonome. Et sur la dimension juridique, nous avons cherché à comprendre quel était l'investissement mis en place par l'ensemble des acteurs, quelle était son importance par rapport à leur entreprise et est-ce que les investissements mis en place pouvaient être redéployés dans le cadre de d'autres travaux ou pas. Donc, on passe aux résultats de la recherche. Pour ce qui est de la recherche documentaire, donc en France, l'État français a mis en place une stratégie de développement du véhicule autonome 2020-2022 qui donc regroupe l'ensemble des acteurs impliqués dans l'écosystème du véhicule autonome en général et identifiant donc les institutions de l'État aptes ou impliquées aussi dans ces questions-là. Nous avons identifié aussi différentes terminologies. On parle de véhicules autonomes, automatisés, connectés, véhicules à délégation partielle ou totale de conduite. Au début, on pense qu'on parle un petit peu de la même chose, mais en réalité, face à des spécialistes de la question et des gens qui maîtrisent vraiment le sujet, on remarque justement qu'un véhicule autonome n'est pas nécessairement automatisé ou n'est pas nécessairement connecté. Donc, chaque terminologie désigne un véhicule avec ses propres équipements et donc son propre cas d'usage. Pour ce qui est des niveaux d'automatisation, donc la norme, c'est la norme SAE internationale sur les niveaux d'automatisation. Elle est utilisée dans le cadre des discussions entre les différents acteurs. Néanmoins, dans le cadre de la stratégie, on préfère parler de cas d'usage plutôt que de niveau d'automatisation, puisque ça reste des définitions d'ingénierie et qui sont bien évidemment aptes à évoluer. Nous avons identifié aussi de nouveaux acteurs. Nous avons identifié la nécessité pour la France d'attendre un amendement de la Convention de Vienne 68 puisqu'elle en est signataire pour justement pouvoir faire évoluer son système réglementaire et législatif. Chose faite, puisque la Convention de Vienne a été amendée et il y a eu du mouvement dans le cadre du règlement français, notamment par l'apparition d'un récent décret portant justement sur la responsabilité pénale des véhicules autonomes. Pour ce qui est de l'approche discursive, donc l'enquête a donné comme résultat que en termes de terminologie, donc le terme véhicule autonome était utilisé par l'ensemble des enquêtés dans le cadre de leurs échanges. Véhicule à délégation partielle ou totale de conduite qui d'ailleurs est apparu dans le cadre de la stratégie en 2017 et utilisé par près de 20% des enquêtés et c'est surtout utilisé par des acteurs issus de la sphère étatique, de la sphère publique. Donc l'État a posé ses propres terminologies qui sont véhicules à délégation partielle ou totale de conduite ou conduite automatisée qui est d'ailleurs utilisés comme définis dans le cadre de l'amendement, dans le cadre de l'amendement de la Convention de Vienne. Chez les constructeurs, on parle de véhicules autonomes, véhicules automatisés, connectés, mais on veille toujours à mettre et à dire et à mettre en avant la différence entre ces différentes terminologies. Pour ce qui est du monde de la recherche, on connaît sur du véhicule automatisé, connecté, conduite automatisée. Là encore, on met en avant la différence qu'il y a entre ces différentes terminologies. Et pour les autres, donc les assureurs, les usagers à travers les associations d'usagers, etc., on reste sur la terminologie classique qui est le véhicule autonome. Pour ce qui est des niveaux d'automatisation, donc comme dit tout à l'heure, ils sont pas en fait pris en compte comme tels dans la réglementation. Néanmoins, près de la moitié des enquêtés connaissent la différence et ont assimilé la différence entre les différents niveaux d'automatisation. Pour ce qui est de l'anticipation et l'avis des enquêtés sur la possibilité d'avoir des véhicules autonomes de niveau 5, donc totalement autonomes, circuler en France, 40% pensent que ça sera dans 15 à 20 ans, 10% pensent qu'on n'aura jamais des véhicules autonomes, totalement autonomes dans notre vie réelle. 26% des enquêtés pensent que ça sera dans plus de 20 ans. Pour ce qui est des types d'investissements, donc on a 70% d'investissements humains, 10% d'investissements financiers des acteurs et 20% n'ont mis aucun investissement dans cette dimension juridique que revêt le véhicule autonome. Pour ce qui est de l'importance des investissements, donc les constructeurs estiment qu'ils ont mis en place des investissements importants dans le cadre de cette dimension juridique. L'État l'estime pas important puisque pour eux c'était seulement de l'investissement humain, mais ce n'était pas des gens recrutés que pour traiter ces questions, mais c'était déjà des gens qui travaillaient. Donc le dossier véhicule autonome était un dossier parmi d'autres. La recherche aussi, pas important, puisque la question juridique faisait partie, c'est-à-dire était étudiée, mais dans le cadre de projets de recherche incluant l'ensemble des dimensions que revêt le véhicule autonome, donc savoir technologique, économique ou sociétal. Pour les autres, pas du tout important ou nul, puisqu'il n'y a eu aucune implication de leur part et aucun investissement de leur part dans le cadre de ces questions ou pour traiter ces questions. Nous avons donc aussi identifié une relation contractuelle très forte, comme vous le voyez là en rouge, entre l'État et ses institutions et les constructeurs et les équipementiers. Là, j'ai mis un petit extrait d'un entretien où il est dit c'est vrai qu'avec le véhicule autonome, tout le monde se carambole parce que maintenant, on fait des voitures qui conduisent. Donc, on fait des voitures qui doivent respecter le code de la route et donc les lois doivent prévoir le cas d'une loi qui est observée par un véhicule, par une machine et non plus par un être humain. Du coup, les constructeurs se sont vus obligés donc de faire un peu de réglementation puisqu'il fallait face à l'État, face aux législateurs, d'expliquer le fonctionnement de leurs véhicules, d'expliquer le fonctionnement des systèmes, etc. Donc, ceci explique une très forte relation contractuelle entre l'État et les constructeurs. Nous avons aussi l'acteur de la recherche qui est là un peu moins gros que l'État et les constructeurs puisque le monde de la recherche, à travers l'ensemble des projets de recherche lancés pour traiter les questions du véhicule autonome, constitue un appui essentiel et une aide à la décision donc, pour l'État. Et donc, du coup, il entretient des relations contractuelles avec l'État, mais aussi avec les constructeurs. Pour ce qui est des trois autres acteurs, donc les fournisseurs de logiciels, le monde des assurances et les usagers de la route, donc concernant cette dimension juridique, ce sont des acteurs purement consultatifs qui ont effectivement des relations avec l'État, mais dans le cadre de consultation pour approuver ou donner un avis, mais voilà, ça se limite à ça. Deuxième résultat, donc nous avons identifié une diversité de langage entre les acteurs en termes de terminologie, de niveau d'automatisation, etc. et une divergence des avis sur le futur du véhicule autonome. Tout ceci justifie une contractualisation incomplète puisque les acteurs, les contractants font face justement à un milieu vraiment incertain dans lequel ils pourront pas anticiper l'ensemble des situations futures pour pouvoir prendre des décisions. Ceci, comme expliqué au début quand j'ai expliqué les hypothèses, ceci va engendrer des coûts de transaction beaucoup plus importants. Donc, en raison de l'incertitude et surtout du comportement opportuniste plus probable. On va parler maintenant de l'implication des constructeurs et les équipementiers dans le processus de mise en place donc, du cadre législatif et réglementaire lié aux véhicules autonomes en France. Et leur investissement humain et financier dédié justement à traiter des questions d'ordre réglementaire ou justement pour aider à mettre en place le nouveau cadre réglementaire et législatif. Donc, les transactions identifiées dans ce cadre-là jouissent de caractéristiques d'actifs mixtes puisque il y a eu un investissement humain et financier important. Donc on est dans un environnement à forte incertitude et une fréquence donc qui est donc la transaction va avoir lieu à plusieurs reprises, donc on est face à une fréquence des transactions récurrentes. Donc, tout ceci montre que nous sommes quand même face à des transactions assez compliquées qui nécessitent justement ou qui impliquent des coûts de transaction très élevés. Donc, les contractants ou les acteurs impliqués dans ces transactions devront faire le choix dans un environnement institutionnel donné, donc dans le cadre des lois et du système déjà existant, de choisir le mode de coordination qui permettra de minimiser au mieux leur coût de transaction. Donc, pour cela, ils vont opter donc pour on a remarqué qu'ils ont opté pour une contractualisation néoclassique. Donc, dans le cadre de cette contractualisation, ceci en fait explique un mode de gouvernance ou une structure de gouvernance hybride, puisque ce mode de gouvernance s'impose en fait lorsque les contractants font face à des spécificités, à une spécificité des actifs qui est très élevée et que ceci rend en fait les liens entre les différents acteurs assez compliqués. Et donc, ça implique justement une relation très étroite entre eux. L'identité de l'ensemble des acteurs va importer au plus gros point. Et donc, ils vont justement aller vers une gouvernance dite hybride ou une gouvernance dite aussi bilatérale, mais plus connue sous un mode hybride, qui va justement permettre à ces contractants que chacun d'eux garde son autonomie, mais qui pourront justement mettre en commun des investissements pour réaliser à la fin un objectif commun. Donc, pour ce qui est de la suite de la recherche, nous allons faire pratiquement la même démarche pour, là encore, identifier ou anticiper le mode de gouvernance concernant la dimension économique, sociétale et technologique que revêt le véhicule autonome. Et enfin, la thèse devra donner lieu à un théorique du point de vue économique et de la politique publique. Pour conclure, je dirais qu'aujourd'hui, la France est arrivée à un consensus entre les acteurs, puisqu'elle a mis en place un cadre réglementaire et législatif lui permettant de faire circuler des véhicules autonomes. On n'est pas dans le totalement autonome, mais c'est des véhicules autonomes de niveau 3 sur leur sol. Et à l'avenir, le système réglementaire devra certainement encore évoluer pour s'adapter aux nouvelles technologies qui arriveront là incessamment. Et donc, ça posera aussi autour de la table les mêmes personnes, peut-être pas, peut-être d'autres acteurs, mais il sera nécessaire de faire encore évoluer la réglementation. Je vous remercie pour votre attention et je suis à votre disposition pour toutes vos questions. Merci.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes left, but will this research be expanded to include other EU countries?
Non, la recherche s'intéresse juste à la France. Donc, j'essaie justement d'anticiper le mode de gouvernance dans le cadre de la politique publique sécurité routière en France.
So you do plan to, I noted you only had 42 participants across a number of domains. You will expand that going forward?
Ben, en fait, là, l'ensemble des données ont été récoltées et nous avons pratiquement identifié l'ensemble des personnes qui traitaient de la sécurité, de la question du véhicule autonome en France. On a eu des retours négatifs, des personnes qui ne voulaient pas intervenir et participer à la recherche. Donc, ceci a diminué le nombre d'enquêtés, mais les 42 personnes englobent, en fait, ils sont issus de l'ensemble, donc on a touché à l'ensemble des acteurs. Donc, dans les acteurs, je prends l'exemple des constructeurs, donc on a touché à tous les constructeurs automobiles français. Au niveau de l'État, on a des entretiens avec l'ensemble des ministères impliqués dans la stratégie nationale du véhicule autonome.
Well, thank you, Yasmin. I'd like to
Merci.
thank all the speakers for some very interesting presentations. Give us a lot to think about regarding this new technology as we move forward and how people are going to view it and how perhaps we're going to influence it as it goes forward. So thank you very much. I want to thank you all for keeping on time and making my job easy. I hope you've enjoyed the conference, and I thank you for attending, and goodbye.